For nearly 2 decades, Roche held a position as a powerhouse among cancer companies. But as the Swiss pharma navigates a monumental patent cliff, it's being forced to carve a new future. BioCentury's man in the UK, Stephen Hansen, joins us to discuss what's next for Roche. And we'll get the latest from Washington editor Steve Usden on Trump 2.0's impact on biopharma. And my fellow executive editor, Selena Koch, talks precision medicine. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and this is the BioCentury This Week podcast. Okay, remaking Roche. Stephen, for years, oncology drugs were synonymous with Roche and Genentech. And now we find this once dominant cancer company is beginning to overhaul its strategy. Why the move away from cancer?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Well, I think we can start off by saying this wasn't necessarily a deliberate move. I don't think in any way Roche wanted to lose their leadership position in cancer, but maybe to set a little bit of context here. So I'm sure we're all very aware of what I guess called in the story sort of Roche's triumvirate of cancer therapies. So the Herceptin, Avastin, and Rituxan programs that sort of really came to be their biggest blockbuster sellers kind of through the 2000s and 2010s. So that kind of peaked in 2016 when Roche's cancer sales were about 64% of their overall pharma sales. And, when you kind of zoom in on their top 10 drugs, it accounted for 76% of their top 10 sales. So very much largely a cancer-driven, cancer-focused company in that respect. But kind of basically what happened was effectively Roche sort of failed to defend that leadership position. This was kind of obviously the period when all the PD-1, PD-L1 drugs were launching. And as I'm sure a lot of the listeners know, Roche was in on that, but they were kind of late to that party. So they weren't the first, they weren't the second. They were the third one to launch a PD-L1, Tecentriq, atezolizumab. It's done well, I guess, in relation to a typical drug launch, right? It did about $3.5 billion in sales last year, which is great by most measures. But when we're talking PD-1s, PD-L1s, it's not as great when you compare what Merck did, where it had 29 billion in sales for Keytruda. So effectively, Roche's attempt to kind of keep that leadership position by focusing a lot on IO, immunotherapy, just didn't pan out. And so they really, I think luckily for them, they had other programs going on outside of cancer that really kind of helped to kind of get them through this tough period.
Stephen, did they do any transformative deals along the way that helped push them in this direction?
Yes and no, I think is the sort of the cagey answer there. They did do several deals sort of along the way here to try and bring in some new stuff beyond what they were developing internally. Fortunately, several of those were kind of missteps. They tried to do sort of the niche indication precision oncology. That unfortunately hasn't really panned out yet with the Ignyta deal. They looked at cancer bioinformatics, doing diagnostics, doing, big data deals. Those really haven't panned out yet as either, as kind of one thing I heard there was that maybe they just came in a little bit too early. So it still could pan out, but they really, they essentially rode off the valley from those deals over the past couple of years. So I don't think they see a near-term value there being developed. And then they pushed into other areas like gene therapy with the Spark Therapeutics acquisition. And unfortunately, that was $4.8 billion that they really haven't seen anything materialize from that either. So M&A hasn't really been a help in building that out. But what they did sort of have were these great launches in what were essentially new areas for Roche. So if you look at what is now their biggest selling drug, Ocrevus in MS, that was an area that Roche had not really been in before. And it had a fantastic launch and very quickly kind of grew to be kind of the standard of care in that space. You've seen a very similar thing with Vabysmo in ophthalmology, where that very quickly is sort of overtaken as being sort of a leading therapy in that space. Same with Hemlibra and Evretis in SMA. So the way I was sort of thinking about it was sort of Roche sort of had this sort of really bad patent cliff situation with the cancer drugs. We're not able to follow it up, but they kind of were somehow able to make kind of lemonade out of these lemons and finding these other therapeutic areas that they could find some real success. And so I think that's in some ways real kind of credit to them for being able to expand beyond cancer and move into some of these new areas.
When you look to their future, and the deals maybe they've done recently or what they have in their pipeline, like which of these new therapeutic areas do you think they're going to see the most growth in?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Celine. And it points to, as you say, I think this push beyond cancer is only set to continue and grow even more. So they just highlighted in their 24 results, they showed 12 drugs that they see as reaching peak sales of 2 billion or more kind of going forward. And 10 of those are outside of cancer. And there are two deals in particular that they did recently that I think are going to, be a big driver of that. So one of them was a couple years ago, they bought Televant, which gave them one of the leading TL1A antibodies that has shown some pretty promising sort of mid-stage data. And I think TL1A is one of the hottest I&I targets that they see as having pretty big opportunity even beyond, sort of the Crohn's UC, which is kind of where a lot of these drugs are focusing now. And then obviously the other one being their acquisition of Carmot Therapeutics, which got them into obesity. Now, obviously, there's tons of competition there, but I guess my perspective on that is that it's also just such a massive opportunity with so many patients that I don't think this is going to be a space where there's kind of a one or two players kind of take the whole pie. I think there's plenty of opportunity. This is more of a supply game. So as long as Roche develops these programs that so far look pretty competitive, as long as they stay that way, and as long as they can build out the manufacturing to be able to supply the market, I think that this could be a big opportunity for them there as well. So no, I think it would be interesting to see how Roche projects this forward.
More deals on the horizon?
Possibly. I mean, but like I said, they've highlighted these 12 programs, and there's several more that they see as blockbusters as well. I mean, they look like they've actually done a pretty good job of kind of bridging this patent cliff and come out relatively kind of unscathed on the other side. Not that I think it was done in the way they intended to do it, but I think the future looks pretty promising. I mean, I think that they've got some really interesting programs coming through. It could be that they do more deals. I'm sure that they'll consider it, but I don't think they're in a position anymore where they have to do deals to kind of make up for anything. I think they've got a pretty good pipeline to work from now.
So do you think that the fact that they don't have the same kind of pressures, to meet demands from investors that other companies of their size have has helped them to have this kind of strategic vision and be successful?
Possibly. I mean, I think they're under the same pressures in terms of delivering top line growth, hitting the same financial metrics other companies do. I think that potentially what they've done a better job is that they've done a better job of reacting to their needs when things don't pan out as they want to. I think sometimes you can see at other companies where they kind of think they can still make it work and they keep pressing. Whereas I think I would give Roche credit for, being willing to adjust. And, when things aren't working, then you find something that will work. In my mind, I feel like that's a credit to them.
All right. Well, it's a piece well worth reading. I know so because we've had a few high up former Roche executives reach out and give Stephen props on the piece. You'll find a link in the show notes. There's some great graphics in the piece, kind of sketching out what the programs are and where this company is headed. All right, Stephen, thanks for joining us. And Stephen will be hosting the pod next week, so this serves as a little warm-up session for you, not like you need it, but I'll be off in Singapore along with Simone at our East-West Summit, the fourth one, which should be a good event, but the podcast will, of course, be in very good hands. Now, I'd like to turn to a listener question. We did a recent special edition of the podcast on psychiatric drug development, and we had a listener ask, what do you think will be the biggest challenge in the area of precision medicine moving forward? And we have Selena here to answer this question.
Thanks, Jeff. It's exciting to have a question from a listener. Let's see. So the biggest hurdle to precision medicine in psychiatry, I think, won't surprise anyone, but it is the biggest. There's really only, I would say, one playbook for precision medicine that's been reliable, like being able to produce effective, marketable precision medicines over and over. And that is the model of targeting a genetic driver of disease in the subpopulation of patients who harbor that mutation. And this is, of course, the playbook in cancer, You can think of targeting ALK and ALK rearrangement positive tumors. And there's many examples like that, where your target and your biomarker are directly, sometimes they're one and the same. Sometimes they just have a very tight link, not many levels of indirection there. Okay, but when you think about psychiatry and what the genetics have taught us about psychiatric conditions, it's a very different picture. Genetic studies of psychiatric conditions have not yielded causal driver genes. Most often, what they've shown is that there are lots of little, maybe modest risk factors, in many cases together with environmental factors, that come together into a multi-hit sort of induction of disease. And so that's a pretty different situation, where you can't just take that driver gene playbook from cancer and port it over to this new area and expect it to work. So it's uncharted territory in that sense. And I think the inroads that companies are making into these diseases just look pretty different due to the lack of biological definition of, say, depression or schizophrenia or whatever. You end up instead with these diagnostic criteria that are based on symptoms. And there's many different symptoms, and different patients have different clusters and severities and whatnot. So, the first pass here is companies looking to reduce that symptomatic variation, trying to figure out, okay, for my therapeutic mechanism, what are the most relevant symptoms that relate to this target biology, say, and then how can I enrich my population for patients who have those symptoms, where those symptoms are predominant. You've seen J&J do that and a few other companies. And then you run into the challenges of, well, how are you measuring those? Subjectively or objectively? Subjective tests are obviously kind of inherently imprecise, but if you think about rolling them out as a biomarker to actually pick patients in the real world, they're highly convenient. Objective tests are, well, they're just more scientific by their nature, but, depending on what it is, how are you actually going to deliver it in the real world? What if it's an EEG signature, for example? That's not something that depression patients would normally, get today. So those are some of the challenges I think companies face today.
All right. Thank you for that, Selena. If you have a question for us, drop us a line. We're always keen to hear what's on our listeners' mind. All right. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll turn to Washington.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit in Singapore. This March, BioCentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner McKinsey & Company returned to Singapore for the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit. This year's theme, how to globalize Asia innovation from cross-border deals to the new co-model. Meet key players from across Asia's emerging arc of innovation, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and Southeast Asia. Don't wait, deals are closing every week. Register today at biocenturyeastwest.com.
Okay, we're back. Let's turn to Washington and have a look at the latest in Trump 2.0's impact on biotech and pharma. Steve, I've got to ask, what are 5 things you did last week?
So, funny that you should ask. Yes, I've got my memo ready. 1, I attended the Pharma Forum. The trade association rented a theater on the wharf in Washington, which was cool because I'd never been inside before. My kids have attended concerts there, but they never had anything that I wanted to go to. Highlights. Pharma CEO Steve Ubel hailed President Trump as the disruptor-in-chief and expressed optimism about the pharma industry's relationship with the Trump administration because he said the pharma industry is also a disruptive industry. Incoming pharma CEO Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, started off in his parting remarks painting a grim picture, saying that the Biden administration had just about destroyed the biopharma industry. He said that China is eating our lunch. 75% of FDA's cancer INDs granted last year were to Chinese companies, he said. But he said he's still optimistic because Donald Trump is going to make America great again, including making America great again for biopharmaceutical companies. Number 2, I learned on Friday evening that the FDA NIH Rare Disease Day, originally scheduled for February 27 and 28, has been postponed. This came a week after patients and advocates were told that it would proceed as planned. And really, it's a highlight of the year for many of these patients and for their families. Hundreds have already booked travel to Washington, D.C., and it's an enormous disappointment to have this postponed, really canceled. at the last minute. There are going to be other events in Washington that rare disease advocacy organizations have scheduled, but really the opportunity to hear from the acting heads of FDA and NIH and FDA scientists, and also to present their activities and their advocacy activities to each other at the NIH campus was something that many of them were looking forward to. 3, I spoke with FDA and NIH employees who received the email from OPM requesting that they do what I'm doing now. They tell about the 5 things that they'd done in the prior work. Elon Musk posted a note on X saying that anyone who didn't respond would be fired. By Sunday night, HHS was telling its staff not to respond for now. They're saying put it on hold. So there's a lot of uncertainty. What's this all about? What are people going to do? Basically, look, it's a second ruined weekend for federal employees. They spent last weekend checking their emails, checking their texts, and calling each other to find out who was being fired and who wasn't being fired. And they spent this weekend thinking about how they're going to deal with this email. 4, I spoke with FDA staff who had been fired last weekend. Now, some of the firings have been rescinded. Nobody knows exactly how many were fired. Nobody knows exactly how many were rehired. It looks like about 700 were fired, and maybe about 100 were rehired, including about 20 at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And 5, I got readouts on the White House meeting that pharma CEOs had last Thursday with Trump, also with HHS Secretary Kennedy and Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. 2 themes at the meeting. Trump is obsessed with the idea that U.S. drug prices should be lower than those in other countries, and he is furious that they aren't. Second, he wants drugs manufactured in the U.S., and he views tariffs on pharmaceutical imports as a tool to achieve onshoring. That's what he told the CEOs, and it's notable that after the meeting, he brought Albert Bourla, the chairman of pharma, to a reception that was being held at the White House, and he introduced him to the assembled crowd as a great American businessman, and they booed him. And I think that really provides kind of a wake-up, or it should provide a wake-up about how President Trump's followers, how the people who are his most loyal supporters view Pfizer, but more broadly, how they view the American pharmaceutical industry.
Well, our production man, Cole Travis, and I had a little side bet there that number 5 was going to be a trip to Ben's Chili Bowl. I only partially joke. I mean, these are very difficult times, and what better than a little comfort food at one of DC's finest institutions to kind of help ground you in a little, goodness amid troubled and unsettling times. Steve, any further comments on where you see things going next in the Trump administration's policies on the biopharma industry?
So look, what's going to happen at FDA and NIH? I think there's going to be, it looks like there's an effort to kind of right the ship a little bit at FDA. What's going to happen next? We don't know. I think some of that's going to depend. A lot of it's going to depend on what the incoming FDA commissioner, Marty Makary, wants to do and is able to do when he gets there. At NIH, things are looking grim, and I think there's a consensus there certainly among senior staff that they're going to get grimmer, that they're going to get worse. What's going to happen with other things? So the big agenda item, the big ask that the CEOs had when they went to the White House is that they want the so-called pill penalty, the 9-year threshold for small molecules to be subject to the Medicare drug price negotiation program. They want that to be increased to 13 years to be in parity with biologics. And they have been pushing to have it included in the reconciliation legislation. I was told by people who spoke with CEOs who were at the meeting that Trump said that that's not likely to happen, that would jeopardize enactment of the budget reconciliation legislation, and he's certainly not willing to do anything to jeopardize that legislation. So it's really not clear what a vehicle would be for enacting a fix to the pill penalty, even if the Trump administration favors doing that.
All right. Well, Steve, you've got a couple of stories out today. I look forward, I will edit them. I can't say that I'm looking forward to more of this difficult news out of Washington. You did talk about chaos and opportunity. Obviously, the pill penalty was a big one on the wish list in terms of the opportunity column. Are there any other things that pharma has really been hoping they might be able to push across the goal line? I know you've mentioned like reworking user fees. You mentioned kind of a host of other opportunities. I'm curious, anything else in the win column, on the near-term horizon for pharma?
Well, I don't know about near term. I think medium term, long term, it's still up in the air. What's going to happen with FDA on a couple of fronts? There's a possibility that McCary will come in and decide to take on board some of the ideas that people who believe that there are ways that FDA could be restructured to better promote innovation favor. That's a possibility. What's going to happen on user fees? That's an enormous question. I think that there's a consensus among people who are working on this that the only thing that's not going to happen is a no strings attached, simple reauthorization of user fees. The whole idea of user fees is going to be reconsidered, probably rebranded, and we don't know what's going to come out of it. There's an opportunity there, of course, and there's also a great deal of risk.
All right, Steve. Well, I know you've obviously been working the phones through the weekends. Hope you can get a little downtime as you've got a lot to cover, and your stories have really shed a lot of light on what is going on behind the scenes. So appreciate that. And Stephen, Selena, thank you as well for joining today. As I mentioned, Stephen will be here next week to host the podcast, and we'll be giving Steve a little time off to re-energize. So Steve and I will be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, we have our sister podcast coming out later this week. I will be in conversation with Zahid Monir, Senior Managing Director of BNP Paribas. That should be a good one. So do tune into that wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you have heard today, subscribe, like us, leave us a comment, drop us a question. Thank you for tuning in, and a thank you to Kendall Square Orchestra, the Boston-based music group that provides the music for our podcasts.